But this op-ed by China's ambassador to the U.S. takes the cake. After covering up the infection, lying about human-to-human transmission, unleashing this on the world, now they have the gall to say there is no time for scapegoating countries. It's not called scapegoating. It's called assigning the blame where the blame is due. And then they go further. The ambassador goes further and said, this is not the time to fan the flames of racism and xenophobia. The Chinese Communist Party propaganda operation knows very well that the fastest way to shut down any discussion in America is to accuse someone of being a racist.
Why has the Chinese Communist Party been buying up, hoarding, and restricting the export of medical supplies, even those manufactured by American companies in China? How is this related to the regime's propaganda efforts? How has the Chinese Communist Party, quote, infected the world and influenced international organizations like the World Health Organization? And why exactly is the Chinese regime such a big advocate of globalism, especially at the time of the coronavirus pandemic? In this episode, we sit down with Curtis Ellis, a Senior Policy Director with America First Policies. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Curtis Ellis, so great to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
It's always nice to talk with you, Jan. Thanks for having me.
You know, Curtis, we talked last February as we were this whole coronavirus, or CCP virus as we call it, situation was unrolling, kind of unfurling. We were learning more and more about what was going to happen. We didn't understand the gravity of it. What we talked about actually was the perils of locating your supply chain. I think you had mentioned, you said, don't put all your eggs in one basket, i.e. China, right? And I think some of our discussion is becoming extremely timely now. I just saw this headline in the New York Post, which basically is telling us about the fact that American manufacturers have been telling the White House that they've been wanting to export some of their safety products like masks and so forth outside of the country, and the Chinese government actually prevented them from doing so. So I think this, basically, what better can explain your point than this? I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to that. We'll start there.
Yeah, this is really interesting, Jan. You and I were early adopters of this knowledge that locating your industry in communist China, not a good idea. Global supply chains, a lot of hidden risk built into them. And just as a business doesn't want to be dependent on a sole supplier, a single supplier for its inputs, you don't want to be dependent on a single country for your inputs or your finished goods. Now, it's really interesting, that story you referred to, how Communist China prevented American companies with ostensibly American-owned factories in China from exporting the output of those factories to America. This is essentially nationalization by another name. Essentially, the Communist Party of China nationalized those factories. They say, you own them, but we're going to keep everything that comes out of the factory. So, I mean, this is sort of the worst of both worlds. You get to pay for the upkeep of your factory, but we get the fruits of the labor, the fruits of everything that comes out of that factory. So that's not a good position to be in. And it really shows the danger of having your supply chains inside a country ruled by a all-powerful dictatorial regime that doesn't obey, doesn't have rule of law. It can basically do what it wants. It also shows a bigger picture, the bigger problem of the philosophy of globalism and globalization. The idea that, and you still hear this, you still hear the apologists for globalism talking about, we're all in this together. There is no need for national boundaries. The pandemic shows how we have to attack this on a global scale. Look, when push comes to shove, the national government are going to do what they have to do to protect the people close to home. That is, the people within their nation. There are now something like, at last count, 48 countries that imposed export restrictions, just like China did. China restricted the export of key medical goods. They did more than that, and we'll get to that later. But they're not the only one. The European Union did it. A whole bunch of other countries said the same thing. We are not going to allow companies operating in this country to sell outside of the borders until all the people inside the borders are taken care of. So this shows that globalism, this idea that people are going to be more loyal to this theory, this concept of one world and what's good for the global economy, some type of libertarian fantasy land, that they're going to be more loyal to that than to their neighbors and to their country of birth and their culture that they're familiar with. It's balderdash. I mean, that's just an elitist fantasy. And what you see is that, sure, the people that go to Harvard are more loyal to their classmates in Harvard. And if their classmates at Harvard came from France or España or China or Malaysia, oh, well, we're beyond all this nationalism. They identify with their fellow classmates, their graduating class from their elite university, more than they identify with their country, the Americans in particular, their country of birth. But what they forget is that all of these other people from these other countries still have a very strong attachment to their own country. And particularly in the case of China, very nationalistic. The Chinese Communist Party, while it talks about the international proletarian revolution or whatever, or globalism, now that's their cover story, is globalism, and a harmonious world all under one sun. They are highly nationalistic and they want that sun to be of Chinese characteristic. So we see now that it's dangerous. The whole idea of global supply chains has inherent weaknesses in it. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and we see that China is a very weak link in any kind of chain. And we also see that the entire idea of globalism, of loyalty to the global economy rather than to one's own country, doesn't stand up under pressure. Put under pressure of a pandemic, put under pressure of a national emergency, countries, nations will revert to their default position of protecting their own citizens first and tell the global economy, you guys come later, get online.
Curtis, you mentioned that the Chinese Communist Party went a step further than this. What was on your mind?
Yeah, so what we see is that the Chinese Communist Party, this is just unbelievable. It would be bad enough if they stopped the export of crucial medical supplies. It would be bad enough if they wouldn't share crucial information about the virus so the world could prepare for it. But then they also sent their agents out, their United Front workers, their front companies, all kinds of different people around the world buying up on the world market, buying up these protective personal equipment, the PPE, buying up the crisis supplies that you would need in a medical crisis, buying billions of dollars worth of this, scouring the planet to corner the market globally. And they bought it and they shipped it all to China so that nobody else in the world had warehouses full of masks, gowns, ventilators, face shields, gloves, the things that the frontline workers need. So this really raises some serious questions about what did the Chinese Communist Party exactly have in mind? What were they planning for? I mean, by this point, they already knew the virus was loose. They already knew there was human to human transmission. They, of course, hid that or lied, whether hid or lied. They concealed that information from the World Health Organization. They concealed that information from Western researchers, from American researchers. And then they went around, and at the same time they knew there was human to human transmission and this thing was on the loose, they went around the world and they bought up the world's supplies of the equipment the world would need to defend itself. That is criminal. I mean, there's really no other word for it. That's criminal. Oh, and I should say, and then they went further. After buying it all up and hoarding it, now they're turning around and doling it out and using it for propaganda purposes to say we're the world's savior. Well, they're saving the world from the fire that they set. That's the best they can. That's the best way to. That's the nicest way to put it.
Well, no, that's interesting because this is exactly the question someone posed to me. I saw that Governor Cuomo was accepting, I think it's 10,000 respirators, or I can't remember now the number that are being brought in from China via Jack Ma and so forth. And someone said, "Well, shouldn't we be grateful for this?" And I said, "Well, of course it's great that we have respirators, but there's an asterisk here, and I think this is what you're talking about."
Yeah, there's a touch of the Stockholm syndrome about being grateful to China for not torturing us to death. Thank you for letting up and not letting us die a miserable death after you've infected us with this disease. Uh, it's really this, and Governor Cuomo thanking China for providing the ventilators. This is exactly the kind of propaganda victory Beijing was hoping for and fishing for. That's the reason they gave these ventilators. And it turns out that Governor Cuomo, in his latest news conference, the latest one I heard, he said that every hospital who needs a ventilator has one. And every hospital has as many ventilators as they need. And there are still a number of them in the New York State stockpile of ventilators. So this was an unforced error on the part of Governor Cuomo to praise the Chinese Communist Party, but it's really this, and we've seen this repeated elsewhere, where China, some European countries donated protective equipment to China when the virus was confined pretty much to the world's knowledge. It was confined to Wuhan and Hubei province, and so European countries donated their supplies to China. And now we see that the epicenter being in Europe, China is selling those supplies back to the European countries. I mean, these people they just can't help themselves. Any way to make a buck, they're out for it. And I'm laughing, but it's not funny. It's really shows the criminal nature of the mentality that rules the Chinese Communist Party. I can't be too clear about that. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is a gangster regime that's it's running a protection racket, and it's using the the medical supplies, ventilators, face masks, et cetera, as a way to buy propaganda to try to conceal, cover up its own uh, its own culpability in this global pandemic. It's really I can't be I can't express my disgust in fulsome enough terms.
Curtis, you mentioned that the Chinese Communist Party or the regime, infected America. And this might be sound like a tall thing to say to some of our viewers. I just wanted you to explain exactly what you mean by that.
Yeah, it's their ideology. Well, there's two ways. Number one, when I say the Chinese Communist Party infected America, you've got the coronavirus. It's now a matter of record, undisputed by anyone except the Chinese propaganda operations, that they knew this infection was loose in Wuhan. They knew there was human to human transmission. And they knew that in order to make a vaccine or even an antibody test to determine if somebody was or had been or is infected, they would need any laboratory developing such a test would need biologic samples of the virus, not just mathematical model or a genome sequence, but actual biological samples of blood of antibodies. The Chinese Communist Party knew all this and they hid it. They arrested the doctors who reported the outbreak. Some of those doctors are dead, others are missing. Then they refused to share biological samples of the virus and of the blood of the infected people so that others, like American researchers or international researchers, could develop the means to uh, test for it. They also refused to share the information that the world needed to prepare for it, knowing how infectious is it? How many people does it infect? What's the fatality rate? How many people does it kill? Uh, and so there was this cloak of mystery and a whole host of unknowns. And then they refused to share the crucial piece of information, which is that it's transmitted from humans to humans. They kept up this cover story, and it was a cover story because they knew it wasn't true. That it goes from bats to humans, or pangolins to humans, or civet cats to humans, and if you're not eating civet cat casserole, you're okay. I mean, they knew that wasn't the case, so they were deliberately hiding crucial information about this, and in that way, they infected the world. This thing got loose. It came out into the world, uh, carried by people traveling from China, and it spread around the world. That's one way they infected the world. The other way that I say the Chinese Communist Party infected the world is with their ideology. They are they have corrupted the World Health Organization, and they've corrupted large segments of Western media with their propaganda operations. They're trying to normalize the Chinese Communist Party. They've been at this now for several decades, trying to portray China as a upstanding citizen in the family of nations. And they're anything but. This is a gangster regime, a criminal organization masquerading as a sovereign nation. It is being run of, by, and for the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party are oppressing the Chinese people, who are wonderful people, hardworking, honest, decent people, among the hardest working people on earth, who revere family and community and ancestors and have a rich culture that's 5,000 years old. The Chinese Communist Party is adhering to the ideology of Vladimir Lenin and Mao Zedong. Chairman Mao was an acolyte of Lenin. And this is a Western philosophy. Marxism is not a Chinese philosophy. So when you criticize the Chinese Communist Party, you be aware that what we're talking about is a Leninist party, not a traditional Chinese party in any way, shape, or form. And they're running that government and running that enterprise simply for their own enrichment. We've seen the stories, it's well documented. Xi Jinping's family, they're making scads of money, millions and millions of dollars overseas in various different enterprises, from gambling to real estate. And they're not the only ones. So, but their ideology, they have been pushing on the West. And you find that the elites in the West want to accept that the government of China is just like our government, and that they're nothing. That, look, they allow private enterprise, and look, people there eat KFC and they drive cars and they go to shopping malls, so they must be just like us, and there's nothing to worry about. And they actually heap praise on them. You see, the New York Times does a multi-part story on how China raised itself up from, or how the Chinese Communist Party raised millions of people out of poverty. That's nonsense. Western capital and the Chinese people's hard work raised millions of people out of poverty. It was not the Chinese Communist Party that did that. They skimmed some some of that money off the top, and they raise themselves into billionaires. It's but you see, this is the cover story, and and as I said, they've infected the World Health Organization. You see people like Dr. Tedros, who heads up the World Health Organization. He's been unabashed at repeating the line given him from Beijing. He held back on declaring this a global health emergency. He held back on calling it a pandemic. When President Trump put in travel restrictions on China, he criticized that. When Beijing told them there was no human-to-human transmission, the World Health Organization put out an advisory to the world telling them nothing to see here, no human-to-human transmission. They've been taking their marching orders all along from the Communist Party of China. And that's probably the most perfect example of how the Chinese Communist Party has infected the world. They've infected these global institutions like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. Go down the list. They're now a member of the UN Human Rights Commission, and this is part of a deliberate strategy on their part. Americans have put their faith, the American elites, let's put it that way. A lot of the people in Washington, the policymakers on both sides of the aisle, the political establishment, Democrat, Republican, left and right, and libertarian, Wall Street, they've put their faith in these global institutions because it's part of that whole globalism thing, that we don't need borders anymore. Multinational companies operate without much regard for borders. So to the greatest degree that we can erode national borders and national sovereignties, that's good for all of humanity. And we're operating in the interest of our shareholder value and for what's good for humanity, not what's good for individual nations. That's sort of the underlying, that's the operating system of underlying a lot of the elite thinking. And so we placed our faith in these global institutions. We placed decision-making power in the hands of these global institutions. It's now, until President Trump came along, trade policy for America was being made in Geneva, not in Washington. It was being made by bureaucrats at the World Trade Organization. It was not being made by the people that we elect, which is kind of disturbing when you think about it, when you put it in those terms. But that's the reality. And so we ceded all this power to the global institutions, to these international organizations, the architecture of the post-war international order. And in case you don't remember, that war was more than 70 years ago. We're talking about World War II. So, and that architecture hasn't been updated. I mean, I think it needs a little renovation. We put our faith in the decision-making power in the hands of those organizations. So what China did is its strategy is to take over those organizations, right? And that way, in one fell swoop, it's taken over the whole world. If everybody's giving decision-making power to these organizations, and then China doesn't have to take over 150 sovereign nations. It doesn't have to take over the United States. It simply has to take over these organizations like the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the organizations that write the protocols for internet and for international standards for industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it has effectively taken control of the world's industrial and political infrastructure.
I mean, that's a incredible assertion, right? And I mean, I think we're seeing as we speak, you know, I guess American people, not just American people, people all over the world, American companies and so forth, basically realizing that maybe they don't have the control that they thought they had. That their supply chains are very fragile, as we discussed earlier. I actually want to kind of turn that around a little bit now, okay? Mm-hmm. And so it seems like a lot of supply chains are going to be coming home because it perhaps this pandemic, and a number of our guests on the show here have talked about this, is showing people basically the fragility of these and how problematic it is to have, as you have said before, all your eggs in one basket or all your eggs, far from home. Now, what is the impact of that reality, which seems to be emerging, on China and the Chinese economy and on the Communist Party?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party understands that this is a fight for their very survival. The Communist Party of China made a deal, an unspoken deal, implicit. It's not there in writing. They don't have to go for elections every 4 years, so they don't have to make a promise to the people. But the covenant they made with the Chinese people is, you stay out of government, you let us run the show, and we will deliver for you a stable, ever rising standard of living, a rising prosperity. Will give you political stability and will give you economic stability. The economy will continue growing, and you will have a better way of life than your parents or grandparents did, and your children will too. That's the deal. That's the idea. And they've been able to deliver that thanks to the infusion of Western capital. Deng Xiaoping, very cleverly, after the Gang of Four, after the Cultural Revolution and the Maoist, doctrinaire, Leninist, hardline communist economics of that era, and the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping realized, well, let's get Western capital in here. And they started preaching things like, to get rich is good. And, and when people would accuse him, and he was actually persecuted into the Cultural Revolution, and they accused him of being a capitalist roader. And his rejoinder to them was, doesn't matter if a cat is gray or black if it catches mice, right? If we can build up the strength of the Chinese nation, we'll welcome Western capital to do that. So for the past several decades, the Chinese Communist Party's well-being, well, let's put it this way, it has thrived on infusion of Western capital. It's like a vampire living on blood, and we've been giving it infusions of blood. Western investment, foreign direct investment in China, building up supply chains. Supply chains is such an antiseptic word. We've been building factories, giving them technology, giving them everything we know. What they haven't stolen, we give them. And what we don't give them, they steal. And as we know, you see the Harvard chemistry professors and researchers and all kinds of American labs are on the payroll of the Chinese Communist Party to turn over the research that's been funded by American taxpayers. But I digress. We have been directly, openly building factories in China, we meaning Western companies, Wall Street, who control the Western companies, and been giving this vast infusion of capital. Now, we saw after the pandemic broke out and its full outline became apparent, Secretary Wilbur Ross, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said, the silver lining to this is that it could speed up the repatriation of American supply chains. It'll bring jobs back to America. People will see we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket, particularly a basket that's infected with civet cat virus or something. So it's not good to have, because remember, we're now a few weeks into this or a couple of months into this pandemic. The first knock-on effect was China closed all its factories. Every factory in China was closed. And so all these Western companies, from General Motors to Apple Computers, couldn't get their parts. There was no virus here that we knew of, right? I mean, it was probably here, but nobody was worried about catching the virus here. They were more worried about being able to get hand sanitizer, or even before that, more worried about being able to get an iPhone, because the factories where they were all coming from had been shut down. So Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said, well, this shows the danger. This is exposed why you don't want to have your supply chains in China, and you should be making that stuff in America. Now, as the pandemic has spread and widened and deepened, and the damage has become more profound, it just drives that message home further. If all of these companies that have been holding up China, supporting the Chinese Communist Party over the last few decades with their factories and providing employment for the Chinese people and providing profits for the Chinese Communist Party managers who skim off the top of all the economic activity in China, if they all move those factories out of China, the economy in China will stumble, if not fall, and the covenant that the party has made with the 1.5 billion people of China is null and void. It's like, trust us, we will deliver economic stability and prosperity to you. Without that constant infusion of Western dollars and Western capital, Western technology, and Western jobs, that they can't sustain that. So they understand, the leaders of the CCP understand that this is a fight for their very survival. They must convince Western companies to stay in China. Yes, you can trust China. Yes, we are the best place to do business. Do not move your businesses out of here, because if that happens, it's Katie bar the door. There will be a lot of very upset, well, there'll be about 1.5 billion very upset people in China. And they'll be very upset with the Chinese Communist Party because they know who runs the show. There is no question. The CCP can't blame the other guy. Like here in this country, it's always a blame, oh, well, it's the Democrats' fault, or oh, it's the Republicans' fault. There ain't nobody else. They're playing big solitaire over there. There's only one player at the table. So if something goes wrong, you know who to blame.
You know, this is so interesting because, we've on this show, we've talked about existential threats, so to speak, in a variety of contexts. Often how the Chinese Communist Party is an existential threat to the West or to freedom in a sense. But here we're talking about a different sort of existential threat. Essentially, the virus is, you're saying, is an existential threat to the party directly because of the global impact of it directly.
And that's why they're fighting so hard to cover up their culpability in this virus. They set out a plan. Horizon Advisory issued a report. I've written about this, drawing on the report. They looked at documents, Chinese language documents, public source, public record. There's no question about the authenticity of these documents, where you have high-ranking officials in the government industrial complex of China and academics in the academic industrial government, think tank space and all that, where they write about how the chaos following the pandemic, where China's factories are back up and running now, for the most part, at the very moment where the West has shut down. Our economy is shut down in the United States, the European economy is shut down. They say this is a tremendous opportunity for China to further entrench itself and expand its influence and integrate itself into global supply chains. Right now, if you wanted to buy any host of products, the only place you could get it from would be a Chinese factory, because the American factories are shut down. I mean, we see that again with Governor Cuomo. I need a ventilator. Where do I go? I got to call China. I want some latex gloves for my healthcare workers. Who do I call? I call President Xi or Jack Ma or some other CCP apparatchik. That's the only place to get this stuff. And China is using that to further integrate itself into the global supply chains. And they say, specifically in these documents, they say, beginning with, but not limited to, medical supplies. And it's an opportunity for them to portray themselves to extend China's power. And they mean soft power, portray themselves as the good guy, we're the savior of the world. Europe's in crisis, and who has come to your rescue? Not the United States, China has. And they're running those ads on television in Europe. I've seen them. In Serbia, They've got footage of the planes, the cargo planes unloading pallets of goods, and then all these Chinese people, all these actors on their iPhones saying, "We're here to help. We're here to help," and it's all this nonsense. The great harmonious world being led by China. They want a position. They want, well, not position. They want China to be the leading power in the world, and they've got to convince the world that the world wants that too. And so this is why, and it's sort of like, as you say, existential threat, or the stakes couldn't be higher. China has to do that. The CCP has to do that, or else the CCP will be exposed for the criminal enterprise that it is. And it's their very survival at stake. If people wake up, if the West wakes up to the threat that China poses and says, okay, we've got to get out of China. This is not about a dollars and cents calculus anymore. It's not simply, well, where's the cheapest place to make something? Is it going to be Mexico, Honduras, or Shenzhen? Well, let's go to Shenzhen. No, there's a national security implication in this. There's all kinds of other things that it's now clear that China is not our friend and doesn't have our interests at stake. And we start moving out of China and moving the manufacturing away from China back to North America. They know their days are numbered. It'll be much more harder for them to maintain power within their own country, let alone achieve their dream of global supremacy.
Curtis, there's been quite a bit of pushback here in the U.S. Against this draft executive order that Peter Navarro is putting together, Buy American executive order. Gordon Chang, in a recent interview on the show on American Thought Leaders, was speculating that there's likely quite a bit of debate even within the White House about this. Based on everything what you're saying, you would think there wouldn't be as much debate.
Yeah, there really should be no debate about this at all. The American people understand that we can't be dependent on these foreign sources of critical supplies, critical medicines. And we know that manufacturing is a very small part of the American economy. So even if you have to pay a little bit more in order to make something in America, it's such a small part of the economy that it'll have very little impact on a macro scale. But we've seen how the trade association for the generic medicine manufacturers are pushing back on this hard. They put out a public letter. They sent a letter to the White House, an open letter saying, we don't want to disrupt the global supply chains. And I've heard people in the White House saying the same thing. Now, there's nothing in the executive order that would interrupt the existing supply chains in the course of this pandemic. The executive order says that after the crisis is over, we'll phase in a Buy American requirement that every time the Defense Department, the Veterans Affairs Department, Health and Human Services buys medicines, those medicines have to be made in the United States. Now, this is a tremendous money-making opportunity for some entrepreneur to open a factory in the United States because they know they have a customer, one of the world's largest customers, the US federal government. And in addition, the executive order says that they would streamline the regulatory approval, the FDA approvals and the other approvals to build these factories, to build these production facilities. And as we've seen in the course of this pandemic, the FDA and many of the other regulatory bureaucracies in the federal government are terribly sclerotic. They're like barnacles on a ship. I mean, they've just encrusted the decision-making process that it's become impossible to do anything. And by streamlining that regulation, it would be very quick, much faster to build these facilities. And then the third part of the executive order would incentivize advanced manufacturing. So we would leapfrog over to the next generation of manufacturing. We're not going to be rebuilding factories and make antibiotics the way we made them in 1959. As a matter of fact, we're not going to even make them the way they're being made today in factories that are already 10 or 20 years old. We're talking about moving to the next phase of manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, which is exactly what we want and need to be doing in the United States. The only excuse for not doing that is to maintain the cartel position that the current manufacturers have. They are maximizing their profit by using these low wage countries, often subsidized by the Chinese Communist Party and other regimes like that, to entice them to come to these cheap low wage havens, and they're making no bones about it. That is the manufacturers, the Association of Generic Drug Manufacturers, are making no bones about it. They're saying, "Oh, it's only through our integrated global supply chains that we're able to provide low-cost medicines to Americans." That's nonsense. And besides, as I said, low cost, we know what the price is of low cost, and it's very high. We've seen how high it is.
Curtis, there are a lot of people arguing, precisely the opposite, that this crisis shows us that how important globalism actually is. Notably, Henry Kissinger, I think in the Wall Street Journal, if I recall correctly. I know we were discussing this offline and so forth. What are your thoughts? You're familiar with some of the arguments.
Yeah, again, the old time religion dies hard. The old time globalist religion, and there is no older timer than Henry K. Dr. K. Dr. Kissinger has made globalism his lifelong project, and he wrote in the Wall Street Journal that the pandemic shows that there's only a global response to this. This shows that there are certain crises that nations are incapable of dealing with on their own, and it must be dealt with on a global basis, and we must strengthen these global institutions to handle these challenges. This is really not that different than what you're hearing from certain political actors in the United States. I mean, it's actually the same thing. Just a short note is that in Dr. Kissinger's opinion piece, he never mentions the word China once. He never mentions China at all, as if you can talk about globalism and talk about a transnational world without this communist Leninist entity having a major role in it. I mean, that's talk about a blind spot. But yes, he says, and what Kissinger says in that piece is, the pandemic is now ushering in a new era, and we have to, and he uses this word, we have to get ready for the next epoch, and it's a transnational epoch where we are no longer where nations have now faded away, and we're now dealing on in this global space. And this, as I started to say before I digressed, this is remarkably similar to what we're hearing from many of the usual suspects in Washington, and many of the political players, not just in Washington, Wall Street, the editorial boards of the major papers and media outlets, that, oh, viruses don't know any borders, and oh, you can't just shut down travel. We're all in this together. We have to cooperate more closely with China to handle this. It's wrong to try to go it alone. You can't do that. There's no question that China would like to see Joe Biden win the next election, because he's been saying that kind of stuff. He's been saying exactly that. He criticized the travel ban as racist and xenophobic. And he's saying we need to cooperate more closely. And I'm not picking on him in particular. This is that globalism. This is that idea that we are now beyond nations. We're beyond national identity. We're bigger than that. We're more sophisticated than that. Patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels. And we are now, we think of ourselves as what's good for humanity and what's good for the world writ large. And See, it's really a question of governance and practicality. You can't eat a steak in one bite. It's much easier to manage a smaller entity. That's why we have mayors and governors and state legislators and a national legislator. And we want the concept of subsidiarity. We want to devolve power to the most local and smallest unit closest to the governed because that's most effective and most responsive to those governed. We want self-governing people. There's certain things that we delegate. We can't govern ourselves entirely. We create these institutions and we invest them in power. The closest they are, the more local they are, the more accountable they are. And so when you get into this fantasy of globalism and globalization, and we're going to invest the power in a faraway capital in Geneva or Brussels, and have them make all the decisions on a global scale, it's just it doesn't work. And so the the Chinese Communist Party is very aware of this. As I said before, they are using the trappings of globalism because it's a siren song. It sounds very nice. So it's unfortunate that people have been in America have been taught and steeped in this cult of globalism so long that they can't see what's actually happening in front of them, that they're being played.
So, Curtis, to your point, there was a recent op-ed in the New York Times, actually by the Chinese ambassador, Tsui Tan-kai, and I'll just read you the headline. I'm sure you've seen this piece. China and the U.S. must cooperate against coronavirus. This is a time for solidarity, collaboration, and mutual support.
It's unbelievable. The New York Times has opened up its editorial pages to Chinese Communist Party propaganda. This is disgraceful. That op-ed is just unbelievable, but it provides the roadmap to the Chinese propaganda operations. It's unbelievable that Western reporters, so many of them, are so credulous, they accept without question the numbers and the data and the figures that come out of the Chinese Communist Party. When the party says that there are no new infections, the Western media reports there are no new COVID infections in China. When they say that the Chinese healthcare workers valiantly fought and bought the West time to deal with the pandemic, they just repeat this as though it's true. You see Don McNeil, the health reporter of the New York Times, saying why China, we should have a team of Chinese doctors come to the United States and help us because we need them to know how to battle this pandemic. Well, how about we have a team of Chinese arc welders come over and start welding people into their apartment houses? I mean, this is just ridiculous. But this op-ed by China's ambassador to the US takes the cake. After covering up the infection, lying about human to human transmission, unleashing this on the world, now they have the gall to say there is no time for scapegoating countries. It's not called scapegoating, it's called assigning the blame where the blame is due. And then they go further. The ambassador goes further and said, this is not the time to fan the flames of racism and xenophobia. The Chinese Communist Party propaganda operation knows very well that the fastest way to shut down any discussion in America is to accuse someone of being a racist. That is the nerve. Touch that nerve, and the corporate media in America twitches. They salivate like Pavlov's dog. And so if you dare to say the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for this virus, their response is racism, xenophobia. It is just unbelievable. And the Times falls for it. They fell for it. They did not have any type of disclaimer on this. They did not have a header they could put above it, a header below it. They didn't say, without evidence, the Chinese ambassador says this. The Chinese ambassador calls for cooperation and sharing knowledge of medical research. Why, I guess they're running out of money to pay their spies to steal it from us. So they want us to share it with them. I mean, this is just, there's a Yiddish word for this. It's called chutzpah. The Chinese have chutzpah. You can't accuse them of not having chutzpah because they sure got it here. But it's really sad to see the credulousness of the Western media. The other example is how Twitter will take down a tweet by, say, Laura Ingraham, who says something rather innocuous about there seems to be evidence from the front lines that hydroxychloroquine is effective in treating the COVID disease. They take that down as misinformation, yet at the same time, China's paid propagandists, the Communist Party's propaganda purveyors, are allowed to operate freely and spew their disinformation and their lies on Twitter, even though Twitter itself is not allowed to operate in China. Wake up, America. Wake up, Jack Dorsey. Wake up, New York Times. You're being played.
So how would you propose them to respond to these sorts of overtures? Because from everything we're seeing, they're extensive.
Yes, they're very extensive. Well, I would like to see the New York Times have right next to it on the page a point by point rebuttal by someone who's pointing out all of the lies that you're reading on the other side of the page. Anything less than that is malpractice. And I would like to see Twitter ban the Chinese propaganda operation from their platform. I mean, they're canceling and banning people left and right, and they're very proud to say we're not going to allow Russian bots and troll farms and Macedonian troll farmers to operate on Twitter. Well, how about the Chinese Communist Party, who are spreading lies every day and trying to undermine free speech, which is what Twitter is supposed to be all about. It shows the depth of penetration that the ideology and the propaganda operations have made in the West. I don't know if they're millennials or what the demographic is, but the people that are policing Twitter have bought into the propaganda lies of the CCP, the deliberate effort over many decades to normalize this revolutionary Leninist party bent on world domination. They have been normalized and they're treated as if they're like a Scandinavian Christian Democrats or something. They're afforded the same deference as the Social Democrats of Germany, and that's astounding.
So Curtis, we're going to finish up momentarily. I just wanted to see, you have any final thoughts before we go?
We have to remain vigilant. I always say, wash your hands to get through this epidemic, and we must wash our hands of China. When I talk about China, most of the time, what I'm saying here, I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party is not part of the Chinese cultural tradition, a rich culture, 5,000 years old, that has made great contributions to the world in so many areas. The Chinese people are hardworking, decent people, honest, and have helped build this country, my country, the United States of America, as well as their own. The Chinese Communist Party is a revolutionary Leninist party imported from the West that is oppressing the Chinese people and is bent on world domination. That's the enemy. That's the foe. That's what we have to differentiate between the party and the people of China. The Chinese Communist Party exists for its own enrichment. It's oppressing the Chinese people, feeding off the Chinese people, and feeding off Western capital in order to enrich itself and maintain its hold on power. And we cannot allow that to continue.
Curtis, and at the Epoch Times, in order to facilitate this differentiation, we're actually calling it CCP virus. There's been a lot of debate about the name.
And I've been doing that as well in my writing. I call it the CCP virus. We can't forget who's responsible for this.
Curtis Ellis, such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.